Welcome, viewers. We have been getting all the global hotspots and news around the world to you. And this time it's about Russia and its neighborhood and what's happening. If you go by Western media reports, there's almost a possibility of a war happening there. And we have an important guest, Moscow's deputy envoy to New Delhi, Mr. Roma Babushkin, with us. Welcome, Mr. Babushkin.
Thank you very much. Namaste.
Namaste. I mean, what's happening? If you go by Western media reports, Mr. Babushkin, there's almost like a possibility of war happening on Russian borders with Ukraine, Russian army in Kazakhstan, from Cuba. What's up? I mean, why the situation is so tense?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your interest and for the interest in the Russian perspective of what's going on, because you should be very careful when you look at the Western sources of information in order to have a balance to you. It's a good opportunity for us to get into more details what Russia is thinking about that. Well, with regard to your question, what happens around, so this is, well, in our view, is clearly part of the process sponsored by the West to establish a unipolar world. Globally, it is manifested in some initiatives like summits for democracy, when the countries are attempted to be divided with non-inclusive confrontational agenda. Lessons of the American democratization you can see in the devastated former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, global and regional destabilization in general. Regionally, if you take Eurasia, it is a regime change policy aimed at bringing to power loyal anti-Russian leaders by a sort of Maidan tactics, using domestic problems to destabilize the situation from outside, even inviting military means like exercises, supplies of weapons to conflicting parties, deployments, etc. All that happens in a way which completely ignores interests of other countries, especially in the security domain. The same, by the way, is also seen when it comes to the LIC situation, when the West is trying to use it in the geopolitical purposes, undermining, therefore...
No, Mr. Babushkin, if I could interrupt and add to my first question, and then you can give a detailed answer, somehow you would say that it's about democracy and a certain narrative that the West is pushing, but then another narrative is that perhaps, Russia under President Putin is marking out its area of influence and in its neighborhood and in a manner that perhaps intimidates the West.
It is in fact vice versa. The West intimidates itself with the mysterious Russian threat, which is not existing. It needed because this is the only reason how the diversified West can be consolidated and therefore be kept under the American leadership, even at the expense of economic interests. Take it the pipeline Nord Stream 2 problem. It's a deliberate Cold War approach, which, by the way, is implemented in violation of agreements and even international law. They are also trying to achieve economic advantages by the widespread unilateral sanctions policies, which are illegal, as well as pressure and blackmail. Look, the Russian defense budget is 20 times less as compared to the U.S. So the question is, who is in a better position to intimidate? Russia wants normal, just, predictable, and equal relations based on universal principles of the UN Charter. We are absolutely okay with the diversified policies, which are natural for a globalized, multipolar world, even when it comes to Ukraine and other neighboring countries, but only if it doesn't happen at the expense of the Russian security interests.
So, Mr. Babushkin, is it really as simple as the West and the U.S. trying to expand NATO and Russia protesting that? Or is it about sort of, reclaiming the civilizational connect with Ukraine in some manner, and if need be, with the use of force?
Look, NATO tries to resolve its biggest issue of identity, since after the Cold War there is no reason for it. What they are doing is trying to invent some purposes in order to hold up their consolidation, obviously for economic and geopolitical purposes of the US, which are behind all of it. Now, NATO is a tool of confrontation. It is not true that NATO is ensuring the European security. It is impossible without Russia, and mutually respectful dialogue is really a principle of undivided security. The expansion of NATO is an existential threat to Russia, since member states under the US leadership deploy missiles and other weapons in the immediate proximity to the Russian borders, conducting anti-Russian military exercises, supplying weapons, deploying nuclear-capable weapons in non-nuclear states. Russia has absolutely no reason and consequently plans to invade Ukraine. Our troops at the border are deployed, and let me emphasize, on our own territory and absolutely on legal grounds for defense purposes due to escalated.
But you are assuring there is no possibility of war. I said you are assuring that there is no possibility of war.
I was saying that the expansion of NATO is the existential threat to Russia, since member states under the US leadership deploy missiles and other weapons in the immediate proximity to the Russian borders, conducting anti-Russian military exercises, supplying weapons, deploying nuclear-capable weapons in non-nuclear states. Russia has absolutely no reason and consequently plans to invade Ukraine. Our troops at the border are deployed, and let me emphasize, on our own territory and absolutely on legal grounds. For defense purposes only, due to escalated NATO military activities in Ukraine and a very advanced level of the military exploration of the Ukrainian territory, which comes even far beyond if it would be a NATO member. It instigates provocative actions being taken by Kiev authorities. For them, the so-called Russian threat is the reason not to implement the Minsk agreements. Kiev obviously is not interested in security talks between NATO and Russia. That's why legally binding guarantees for non-expansion of NATO are now the Russian red line. We don't need promises anymore. NATO more than often broke them.
Right, Mr. Babushkin.
Many times cheated.
Thankfully, dialogue is happening at the topmost level, and even in the bureaucracies between NATO and the Russians. Hopefully, some solution would be found, and all the fears would come untrue. But I want to move on and ask you, what happened in Kazakhstan? What was the real threat? And there might be some alignment, perhaps, between Indian concerns there and Russian concerns.
All right. So we will, of course, discuss the situation in Kazakhstan. But let me come back, briefly to the previous question about the civilizational links between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes.
So I would like just to point that it wouldn't be a better idea for the U.S. to take history lessons and take it more seriously. In this case as well, it helps to better understand the diversity of the world. And if NATO really had peaceful purposes, it would also take into consideration the factor of proximity between Slavic nations in terms of common culture and language traditions, but not to undermine them. And speaking further about Kazakhstan, it was to our estimation, it was a clear attempt to destabilize the country from outside. What is obvious is that there is an aftermath of the American speedy withdrawal from Afghanistan and the mess which was created, spreading radicalization ideology. We are especially concerned with the continuing ISIS presence in the northern Afghanistan. Another question is who brought ISIS there? In Kazakhstan, economic demand from the population became a pretext for coordinated terrorist war against the country, trying to undermine its stability, sovereignty, and constitutional law and order. Kazakh President Tokayev officially applied to the help of the CSTO, and around 2,000 peacekeeping troops were immediately deployed to ensure security of critical infrastructure. It It was for the first time the CSTO potential was used in such purposes, and it appeared to be very efficient. It helped the Kazakh army and security forces to fight terrorist militants. After CSTO,
are we sure that after this deployment, the threat of radical Islamist forces spreading in has been contained?
So there is no doubt about that. This was a well-coordinated move. And by the way, the SCO also supported the way the situation was resolved.
Yes. In fact, that brings me to the next question. Some would say that Russia and China sort of worked in tandem when it came to tackling that situation there in Kazakhstan.
Well, I would take the broader view of that. So with Russia, China has relations of strategic partnership. We are like-minded when it comes to the need of resistance to the Western destructive attempts to impose unipolar ideas by the extended pressure, sanctions, and containment policies, as well as politicization of activities of international organizations. Hence, we can say that this tandem is much broader with India, BRICS, and the SCO member states and other independent countries, which stand for just, equal, and predictable multipolarity with the central role of the United Nations and international law, as well as a unified agenda.
Right. Mr. Babushkin, S-400s are on track. In fact, we had, in the backdrop of President Putin's visit to New Delhi, some talk that even S-500s might be discussed. When do you think the talks might firm up on that part of India-Russia defense cooperation?
Look, the exceptional level of the Russian-Indian special and privileged strategic partnership allows us to speak about everything. So if India is interested, Russia is always ready. Impossible, nothing in our sight, so sky is the limit.
All right. In fact, a senior U.S. State Department official was quoted just a few days back trying to differentiate between CAATSA sanctions against, say, Turkey and India. Would you say it's a welcome move?
Well, what we see is sanctions became misused in a tremendous way for whatever possible or impossible reasons. They became a major tool of the U.S. foreign policy, replacing the culture of diplomatic communication. It looks like the people in the West, instead of good morning, say sanctions. Now they are calling even to personally sanction President Putin. And to be serious, whoever is targeted with the unilateral sanctions and extraterritorial national legislation, it is detrimental to normal international relations. It creates an atmosphere of instability and mistrust, not to mention that it is illegal. Sanctions are clearly a tool of unlawful competition. Look, whatever you take, economic ties or defense cooperation, it doesn't represent any threat to the U.S. security. So why there should be any need for any sanctions?
I think that wisdom has come in and prevailed on the American side. My last question, Mr. Babushkin, and something about which viewers in India would be interested, about the possibility of some information on inquiry on the Russian side on the Mi17 chopper crash that unfortunately killed our first Chief of Defense Staff, General Bipin Rawat. If you could share something on that.
This is a very unfortunate incident, and once again, let us convey our condolences due to the demise and to the loss of General Rawat for India, and it is irreplaceable. He was a big friend of Russia as well. He was a strong supporter to the Russian-Indian Special and Privileged Strategic Partnership. As far as we heard that the investigation was going on, and one of the versions which were aired recently was that was a pilot error. That's very unfortunate. Once again, if the Indian side is interested in to have some Russian expertise of that, we would be ready to render any possible assistance.
Right. But is it inquiry going on at the Russian end?
Well, it is not to my knowledge.
Okay, but you said you are willing to share any information that the Indian side might want.
Of course.
On that note, thank you so much, Mr. Babushkin, for joining us and speaking to us about not just India-Russia relationship, but then the larger global situation. Hopefully, there won't be any war and peace would prevail, wisdom would prevail. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.